Okay, so we have our guest speech from Camilo today, Camilo Ordóñez Barona, who hails from Colombia and has education in India and the Netherlands. I think also some education in the Nordic countries. And then he found his way to Halifax to do his PhD with me. So I think he came in 2009. Camilo came to me wanting to do research on climate change and urban forests. And I told him that I had no money for climate change and urban forests, and that if he wanted my financial support, he had to work on urban forest values, because I just got money to do that kind of work. And so together we found a way over the 6 years he was with me here to do research on urban forest values and climate change. And so Camilo prepared a very comprehensive PhD thesis and got lots of papers associated with that thesis. And then Camilo was looking for postdoctoral assignments. And I think he's now on at least his third postdoc, maybe more. He did do some instructing at in St. Catharines at what's it university? Why am I forgetting
Brock.
the name?
Is it Brock?
At Brock University, he instructed for a year. He did some postdoctoral work with Andrew Millward at Ryerson. Then he spent a very profitable 3 years in Melbourne, Australia, doing postdoctoral research. And now he's working for a couple of years with Tenley Conway as he still continues his search for the holy grail of the professor position somewhere, wherever he can get it. I think Camilo is now either more than a landed immigrant. He may be a Canadian citizen, but he has adopted this country as his home. Camilo, in the last few years, has taken a strong interest in the concepts of urban forest governance. And in the talk, you'll actually see the headers for 4 journal papers he's written in the last couple of years with and without co-authors on various matters with respect to urban forest governance. And so despite the fact that he is, kind of one of the HQP in this network, I felt he had a maturity to be able to give us a pretty strong talk on urban forest governance. So I think with that, Benoit, you could roll the tape, as it were.
You may want to say, Peter, that he was unable to join us because he has a previous engagement, like with potential partners. So he'll be with us again tomorrow, but here he is.
Yes.
Online, and
Yeah,
he'll
lovely.
join us at 1:30.
Thanks.
So do you see the black screen currently?
Yep,
Yeah.
there. So he recorded this graciously for us last night, or was able to get it to us, and then he'll be able to discuss and answer questions after it's over.
Okay, so I will leave the floor to you, Camilo.
Are you restarting it? It's kind of sketchy. Is that, Benoit, are you?
The sound isn't coming through very well.
No,
No, not for us either.
Hmm.
I thought it was mine, but
No, it's the production, I think.
you want me to try from my end? I have a
Yeah.
copy of it.
Yeah, I tried with Preet earlier and it seemed to work well, but
Just a second. Have to remember where I put it. Okay, because I tried it and was working fine last night, so. Now, I have to share screen, don't I?
Yep.
QuickTime Player. Okay, I wonder if QuickTime, can you guys see this?
Yeah.
Hello, everyone. Setting up my slides here.
How's the sound?
And welcome. I want to
I
first
can hear
thank
okay.
Sorry, how's the sound, folks?
Yeah, it's clear but low, very low volume.
Okay, let me, I'll turn my own up. I don't know if that helps you guys. It looks like it's at the highest it'll be at my end here. I'll turn it on again.
organizers of the Summer Field School of U4 for giving me the opportunity to talk about my take on our forest governance and talk about my research.
Oh,
I couldn't be there with you guys today to give a live
that's
presentation.
better.
After the presentation for a Q&A, live Q&A. My name is Camilo Ordóñez. I'm a postdoctoral fellow or research associate. I'm still figuring out what exactly my title is at the University of Toronto, currently Mississauga campus, currently working with Dr. Tanley Conway. Dr. Conway was actually the initial one who was going to present today. And I'm sure she would have given a very, very interesting talk about the role of residents and the role of tree planting organizations in influencing what happens to the trees in cities. My take is a little bit different. I've done a lot of research on local government perspectives on governance. By governance, I mean the process of collective decision making. I'll talk more about what governance is and what it isn't later in my presentation. I want to mention that I am a person who stutters. The words don't come out as I would like them to come out sometimes, and I hope you're patient. Hopefully you have the slides there as well for reference, in case the animation here doesn't work correctly, but it should. What do we talk about governance? I believe there are some key assumptions that we make as to why studying governance is important, or why and how we use the lens of governance, conceptual and methodological frame to study urban forests. Many people who study different aspects of governance may have different assumptions and rationales. Here are just the ones that have influenced my research and my take. The success of urban forestry, having a thriving tree population across the city, depends a lot on human decisions. And I think our conversations in the last few days have really brought that into life. These decisions are not made by just one person or one institution, although city governments, local governments are extremely important stakeholder or actor in governance. The fact is that there are multiple people influencing these decisions, and that's why we have a governance lens to understand how all these institutions, organizations, and individuals come together to make decisions. It's very important to clarify that management and operations shouldn't be conflated with governance, even though sometimes in the literature they are. There are key differences between the two. One, management and operations are more from one institution's or one organization perspective, what they do to manage something. And governance is more from a broader societal perspective, how different organizations and institutions come together to make decisions about collectively owned natural resources, in this case, the trees in our cities. Governance is becoming more and more important because we can plant all the trees that we want, and we can plant the exact tree species that we know are going to do the best job at surviving and providing services. There are still going to be a lot of challenges that we are not going to be able to address unless we address them through a governance or collective decision-making perspective. Some of these challenges are listed here, and I'm going to give you some examples of why governance is important to address those challenges. Well, I have been working in Canada for more than 10 years. I was trained here in urban forestry. I recently lived and acquire a lot of perspectives from Australia, where I worked as a research fellow at the University of Melbourne, in Melbourne, Australia. And some of the research that I present here today is based on my work there. The research was a result of a collective effort from a lot of people, some of which are listed here. And that belonged to a broader research program that we all participated in. Just want to thank all the people who have contributed to this work. Once again, this is a collective effort. In particular, all the people, the professionals who work for Victorian local governments and other non-governmental organizations who have kindly participated in this research. For about 3 years, some colleagues of mine, some of which are listed here, I didn't find enough space to list them all, have established a collaborative research network to study urban forestry in Latin America, currently with the support of the Social Environmental Synthesis Center in the United States. And some of the research that I will present today has been based in Latin American cities. Again, this is a collective effort. I just want to thank my colleagues and thank all the professionals and all the people who have participated in this research. Today, I'm going to give you some background on some of the important challenges being faced by urban forests today, challenges that need to be approached from a governance perspective. I want to recognize that social sciences does not exist in a vacuum. It is always framed by concepts and approaches and lenses and what we together call theory. So I'm going to touch very briefly upon what governance is from a theoretical standpoint. However, this is not a theoretical or conceptual talk. I want to focus on the case studies. So we'll present to you some empirical research that I've done to understand how local governments are engaging more and more in collective decision making. And I will finally reflect with some implications of future research. So first, the challenges. Global cities have ambitious targets to increase tree numbers and canopy cover, as we know. But urban forestry goes beyond planting more trees or planting the right species of trees. It is also about addressing the challenges being faced by urban trees and those things that depend on them, like all these critters right here. These challenges include intensified urbanization. By that, I mean very broadly, processes such as densification, consolidation, expansion, and development. Climate change, providing wildlife habitat, and engaging the community with urban trees. Those are challenges that have a lot of governance implications. Here are a couple of examples of these challenges and why governance is important. Many people will tell you that development is challenging the urban forest, and we've had actually some conversations here about that throughout these past 3 days. But the fact is that it's been difficult to translate the anecdotal evidence that a lot of cities and professionals have into scientific evidence where we can actually quantify how much urban forest is being lost to development. In Melbourne, we had an amazing database of tree removal patterns and locations close to where development had occurred in the city for the past 10 years. And we found that about 10% of the cities that had been removed, of the trees that had been removed in the city over the past 10 years had been within 10 meters of construction or major development sites. While this is less than the number of trees that are being planted by the city, as you can see, sorry, I can't find my notes, just had a small transition there. What is interesting is that we could actually quantify how many trees are being lost to development and what those trees mean for the canopy cover as well for the city. The fact is that canopy cover was not impacted that much since most of the trees that are removed are very tiny. But it is interesting to know the major developments, so not minor developments, these are major developments, had a measurable impact on the urban forest and the ambitious targets that cities have. And of course, a lot of these removals are happening by decisions being taken by stakeholders and people that are beyond the city's control. Community relations are important in urban forestry. And here's a small example of a very interesting study in Detroit, the United States, where researchers interviewed 43 people who refused to have a tree planted in front of their house or their property. And they wanted to understand why people had refused these trees. And I know that many of you have probably heard this expression. I've got nothing against trees, but, and that encapsulates basically what people are thinking about trees. A lot of people have positive attitudes toward trees. They think that trees are quite amazing, but there's a lot of different experiential, so to say, and cognitive dynamics that are going on that influence people's reticence to have a tree planted in front of their house. For example, lack of maintenance. They plant them, they don't maintain them. After 5 years, they decline or look really ugly. And also lack of trust. A lot of people do not trust the organizations that are in charge of tree maintenance or tree planting. Sometimes this is the city, or sometimes there's subcontractors or other types of organizations that do tree planting. And the fact is that if we cannot get trees planted where people live, we cannot achieve our canopy cover gains. So we need to engage a lot of people to be on board with these ambitious tree planting and canopy cover goals. That brings us to the very important question of what is governance? If I were giving this presentation live, I would probably touch base with you guys and see what you thought about governance, how you would define it. But since I'm just a voice in the machine right here, you will have to go with what I say. And I'm sorry for that. But I do want to acknowledge that governance has a lot of definitions. A lot of fields have different perspectives on governance, from sociology to political science to economics to planning, and a lot of different social sciences fields and non-social sciences fields as well. And then the fact is that we all have a notion of governance, and I'm sure you guys all have a notion of governance. Those notions of governance are probably just as right as the more scholarly definition of governance. But for what it's worth, most people will agree that governance may be broadly understood as the process of stakeholders coming together to make decisions about what is collectively owned. And what is collectively owned usually applies to natural resources. And of course, in this case, urban trees belong to us all. We can understand governance through its different dimensions, some of which are listed there. And this is just a way to structure the way we understand governance and its different characteristics, so to say, which include the people who make the decisions, the rules that define the decision-making process, the kind of resources that people have to make these decisions and to implement these decisions, and of course, the different narratives and rationales as to why making these decisions is important. And some examples in urban forestry that have come out from the literature of stakeholder views or governance and management of forestry are listed there. My research has built upon this general understanding of what governance is to try to develop a more empirical understanding of local government perspectives. Why am I motivated to do that? Because governance is absent from a lot of empirical research on the views of professionals working in local governments in an urban forest capacity, which I briefly name, which I name municipal urban forest manager. The views of these stakeholders is very important because to understand decisions in urban forestry, we need to understand first how key stakeholders make those decisions. And municipal urban forest managers are a key stakeholder. These are the people who work in local governments and usually deal with the task of resolving the multiple demands placed in urban forestry. They try to protect the urban forest, they try to make decisions about what to plant, where to plant it, and they try to placate and deal with a lot of demands of urban forestry from a lot of different directions. I wanted to understand what had been said before about urban forest manager views, so I went ahead and we did a systematic review and synthesis of all the perspectives of these studies on municipal manager views through a governance lens, trying to understand how they engage and participate in these collective decision-making processes. And I won't go into too much detail about this study, but there are three features that I would like to highlight from this work. First of all, is that most of the work has been based in the US, and it is difficult to extrapolate what has been done in the US to other countries and other cities, mostly because the US has very particular social structures and very political systems that may not apply to the rest of the world. Second, most studies do not reveal how decision-making varies across different types of cities. Most of the work are kind of single case studies or multiple case studies where they're just trying to find the more generalizable finding across a lot of cities instead of really identifying what differentiates different types of cities. Like, for example, the difference between peri-urban and inner urban areas. And lastly, and most importantly, a lot of themes that are important for understanding governance are not featured that well in this literature, some of which are highlighted here. We organized all the studies according to their themes, to the things that they touched upon, and we came to realize that most of the things that they talk about are the ones that are there related to resources and program performance, kind of things that are more management related, but all the things that are more governance related, like how stakeholders come together, how to engage with stakeholders, how to coordinate decisions with people, and so on, are not featured that well in this body of work. And why is that? Well, partly it's because governance has not been, people are not tuned into governance as they are tuned into management, of course, because urban forestry is a relatively young field in a way, and because governance is usually explored from a theoretical and conceptual perspective, but doing empirical research work on governance is actually a little bit harder. But it is only by advancing this empirical research that we can develop a better understanding of how the people who actually make the decisions, how do they make the decisions, how can they see their role in this collective decision-making process. In our work, we strive to answer the question of how people make decisions about urban forests and analyze their answers through a framework of governance. This involves asking a lot of related questions about how people make decisions, some of which are listed there. And all of these questions, as you can see, reflect the different dimensions of governance that we talked about before. The approach to these questions was grounded in the view of participants, in this case, municipal urban forest managers. This meant that whatever data that we generated was directly related to the voice of these people. However, this data need interpretation, obviously. And in interpreting this data, I mean that the knowledge being generated in this research is negotiated between the researcher and the participants. We have applied mixed qualitative and quantitative social science research techniques to this research, such as interviews, collaborative workshops, and questionnaires, with the qualitative data kind of informing the creation of the questionnaires to kind of minimize the bias that the researchers themselves bring, and rather let the people who actually make the decisions inform how these questionnaires are created. Do not get distracted by the title of this slide, How to Do Governance Research. The caveat of this is that this is not a recipe for success. Of course, I'm not, it is not my intention to be prescriptive about what works and or how it should be done. We need more creative approaches and new methods and new techniques to do this kind of research. And what I'm just presenting is just one way of doing it. Okay, so now to the juicy part. Sorry, I forgot to say that, that just a very, very small fraction of the research that I've done is going to come into this presentation of local government's perspectives. If you want to learn more, please feel free to ask questions later today or see the publications that we have created. I need to give you some context about the work that we did in Victoria, Australia, Melbourne. The first thing is that many local governments across Victoria have ambitious urban forest plans to increase canopy cover. Cities in Australia are very worried about climate change, heat, water. It's a big concern in the country. And a lot of cities are looking into the trees as the solution to a lot of their environmental problems. To coordinate these efforts, the metropolitan area of Melbourne, which you can see highlighted there with the darker colors, which is also known as Greater Melbourne, which is a collection of about 32 local city councils, got together to produce a metropolitan strategy. So each city council, each of those 32 cities in Greater Melbourne and the regional cities, what they call regional cities around Greater Melbourne, have produced their own strategies and their own plans to manage urban forests. But they all got together to produce a metropolitan urban forest strategy, so try to coordinate the efforts across all the cities. And my research was taking place when this process was going on. I was actually one of the people who contributed to these discussions. Every day, there must have been like 40 or 50 people in these meetings over a period of 2.5 years. And I participated in a lot of these discussions as well. So it is important to recognize that there was a lot of enthusiasm at the moment that I was doing the research about working together with all the other cities. The second thing I want to say is that cities in Greater Melbourne are going through a process of renewal of the urban forest. You can see some examples here of pictures that I've taken of tree removals and parks and stuff. This is partly because there's a lot of tree planting going on in these cities. There's also a lot of trees coming to the end of their useful lives. Australian cities planted a lot of trees at the beginning of the century, most European tree species. These tree species are now declining. And part of the reason for that is that Australia, about 10 years ago, came out of what they called the Millennium Drought, a period of about 2 years where they didn't have a lot of rain. And a lot of very old trees just took a hit, and they're now senescing across many cities, particularly in Victoria. I just want to mention that we didn't just study the city of Melbourne. Of course, we studied the experiences of a lot of local governments in Victoria, not just in Greater Melbourne, with a focus in Greater Melbourne, but also the experiences of all those little cities, regional cities, as they call them, around the city of Melbourne. The city of Melbourne is the central city council. You can see it there in the dark color, and it's a very particular city. It's a very wealthy city with very particular social demographics and politics. And whenever people talk about Melbourne, please be mindful that the city of Melbourne is not the same as the Greater Melbourne area, 32 cities. And that's what we try to do, have a different perspective. I also wanted to give you a little bit of context about Latin America, because some of the research that I'm going to present is about Latin American cities. Latin American countries are some of the most, if not the most, urbanized populations in the world. Many of these countries have 70 to 80% of the population living in cities. So when you take it as a region, as a whole region, a collection of countries, it's actually the most urbanized region of the world. But it's also very much biodiverse, of course. And these cities are going to be greatly impacted by climate change. A lot of cities are facing very, very fast development right now. A lot of countries have experienced conflict, and of course are now experiencing a lot of economic development. And this has impacted the way cities are growing and the way cities are changing. So a lot of cities are looking into the urban forest right now, creating plans, creating strategies, planting a lot of trees, dealing with a lot of decisions about how to manage parks and woodland areas and so on. And there's a lot of enthusiasm in the region about what to do with the cities. An example of this is, for example, that the FAO of the UN, the Food and Agriculture Organization, has already organized 2 very successful urban forest fora in the region. There's a lot of momentum going on right now in urban forest research, but there is not a lot of regional level research. These countries don't talk to each other that much. We Latin Americans are not very good at talking to each other. Okay. What did I find? Well, what is studying all these cities and all this, talking to all these people really taught me about governance? First of all, in part of my work, we went out and talked to 24 different people representing 12 local governments in the state of Victoria, Australia. And one of the most interesting things that we found is that internal coordination is very important to improve governance. And I'm going to present these results on the basis of what people talk about the most. These results kind of corroborated the idea in the literature that that the city is not one institution. It's actually, it behaves like a very diverse institution in a way. And in that sense, interdepartmental coordination is a common challenge to make decisions about trees. And municipal urban forest managers are constantly trying to resolve the demands of different departments within their own city. Like what the engineers want, what the planners want, what the park people want, what the water guys want, also, and so on and so forth. And they're trying to make decisions about trees in this really, really complex network of rules and tools and all that stuff. And you can see that a lot of the things that people talk about is about this interdepartmental coordination. The second common thread that in these topics that people were talking about is about public consultation and community views and the residents' perspectives, like how important it was to have a community that was really engaged, that was really pro-tree in a way. Because the fact is that many of these municipal urban forest managers on a daily basis have conversations with community people, and a lot of these conversations are very negative. The positive things about how people think about trees doesn't come out in those daily experiences. Even though from a broad perspective, I'm sure that a lot of people have very positive things to say about trees, but not in the daily experience of many managers. Based on these qualitative results, we developed a Q method questionnaire to confirm some of these ideas of local governments. The Q method procedure is basically a way to assess the range of views that exist about topics in a group of people. This involves developing statements, then telling people to rank these statements in terms of how they agree with them. And when we did this, we received 61 responses from 30 local governments, which is quite successful actually, because we had a contact list of about 100 people across the greater Melbourne area and the regional cities. And we got 61 responses, which is a response rate of about 60%, which is really good, actually. So we are very... Something made us sound, which is really good. Sorry for the distraction. Something was making us sound. And what we found is that people have different views on resources and leadership and the role in collective decision making. The first view, which we call leadership, revealed that some managers see that increasing the resources, so the budgets and the people that they work with and the personnel that they have and all this stuff is not going to help implement their policies and their strategies in urban forest expansion and urban forest protection. But for some people, these things are still very important. So for some cities, resources continue to be quite important. And the interesting thing is that all managers agree about the challenges that development and climate change is posing to the collective decision-making process. We did very similar work in Latin America. It was a little bit different because there's not a lot of kind of previous knowledge on governance on urban forest governance in Latin America. So we did this a little bit different, a little bit more exploratory, not in the same Q method approach that we did in Australia. I received 91 responses with an online questionnaire that we did to explore what different people thought about the collective decision-making process, what was important in that process for them. And we revealed, again, two distinct perspectives. But this time, we revealed again this issue about resources, how resources are really important for people to improve their decision-making. But a very interesting perspective that we revealed is the role of the public. So how important it is to have a good public engagement program or public engagement processes within the people's institutions and organizations and within the city as a whole. And once again, people agreed about the common challenges of urban forests, such as climate change. We're still confirming some of these insights. We're doing much more research. We're probably going to do some qualitative research as well with Latin American cities to really try to understand how people are making decisions collectively about urban forests in the region. And the last kind of research case study that I want to talk about is the importance of trees on private urban land. Trees on private urban land is a different tier of urban forest research, and I think based on some of the conversations that we had yesterday, we realized that there's a lot that we still do not know about trees on private urban land. Because a lot of what we talk about is public trees, the trees that are managed by the cities and that are publicly owned, but the fact is that we don't know what's happening on private land. But we do know that local governments can do a lot to influence what happens to these trees. And a lot of local governments do. As we know, we have private tree bylaws in a lot of cities in Canada. And there are two ways of looking at these ways to influence trees in private urban land. Here's what a common North American kind of a private tree landscape may look like. I recently gave a similar presentation like this to a Latin American crowd, so I had to find a more Latin American image, and this is the city where I come from actually. And you can see how private trees in this image are way more important than public trees. So there are two ways of looking at the way influencing trees on private urban land. The first way is regulation, which penalizes undesired behavior and tells people you need to be permitted to do whatever you want to do with your trees from a government perspective. And the other is an incentive, kind of celebrating desired behavior, but depending completely on the voluntary action of people. We revised a lot of the literature on trees on private urban land. We talked to some people locally in Australia. We also went internationally and talked to a lot of people there, a lot of international urban forest professionals, big names. And we try to figure out, okay, what is innovative? What are some of the new things that people are doing to protect trees in private urban land? And one of the things that we found is this use of tree bond. A tree bond is when a city tells a developer, for example, to pay for the money up front before they do something to the trees in their property. And right after they finish whatever it is they're doing, then the city will return the money back to them. It's kind of applying the pay first principle. If you guys have taken a lot of environmental management courses, you probably know what the pay first principle is. The second thing is tax rebates for keeping trees. So instead of using penalties and charging fees for doing something bad to trees, cities are kind of using stimulants for doing positive things to trees. So if you keep a lot of trees, we're going to give you some money back in the taxes. Or if you spend some money on your trees, maintaining your trees, or mulching them or taking care of them, and we're going to give you back some money in your taxes. A lot of cities are also using these green indexes for new development projects. Sadly, they cannot use it to reach actively for all development projects, but they can use it for new development projects where they say, okay, you need to, if you keep this much of green or this much of canopy cover or this many trees in this new development, we're going to give you some money through a tax rebate. So they're not using penalties at all and regulations at all. They're using stimulation or incentives. There is obviously no silver bullet. There's not just one tool or one instrument that is going to work. The very successful cities that are protecting trees or private land actually use multiple tools, and a combination of regulations and incentives is probably the best way to go. One of the things that we find is that a lot of cities do not monitor the urban forest. So I think a very big opportunity here on understanding what happens to trees on private land is creating clearer baselines. And by doing that, we can actually understand the effectiveness of these regulations and incentives in a clearer way than has been done before, because we still don't know if these new tools are going to be effective. What we do know is that they go beyond business as usual, and they are new and innovative. But what we really need to figure out from a research perspective, I guess, is where they're really doing the job. Are they being effective? Measuring this effectiveness has been challenging. There's a lot of, because how cities conceive what is effective and what is not effective is very local or very context dependent, and we need to move a little bit beyond that to create better science. We recently created a synthesis piece of work on what we learned with all this decision-making research, and I'm going to convey it to you here in 5 key lessons really quickly. First, engaging in collective decision-making is very important to influence decisions about trees in a development context. I do not mean just engaging other stakeholders for developing a management plan or a strategy or a tree bylaw. It's not just about bringing people together for that specific purpose. It's about engaging people in a conversation about trees constantly on a day-to-day basis in a development context. That's what works. A very good example of that is how cities in the greater Melbourne area, by producing a metropolitan urban forest strategy, they engage many development companies in the city to actually participate in those conversations and to see it as a collective process of decision-making about what to do with the trees in a development context. Once again, institutions are not monolithic. Cities are not just one institution, and we cannot see it as such. The fact is that many big organizations and institutions are very diverse, and enhancing how they're coordinated they are within their different units or departments is extremely important for governance. We already talked about this enough. I guess about innovation in tree protection in a private land context. We saw that a lot of people rely on a multifunctional narrative of urban forestry, and more it's becoming the case. I think the evidence that this didn't exist before came from a lot of the policy analysis and document analysis that research has done. I myself have been a contributor to that kind of research, but the fact is that people think sometimes they think in a very different way than what is established in their policies, plans, or their in many ways, and not just in one way. We need to increase urban forest stewardship. By stewardship, I do not mean we need to make residents responsible for tending the trees. There's just a lot of misunderstandings about what stewardship actually means. By stewardship, I mean that we need to give enough opportunities for the community to engage in decision-making processes, participating in consultations, questionnaires, talking to them and stuff like that, in order to achieve what some people call an active citizenship. That's what I mean by stewardship. The caveat here is obviously that I've derived these lessons from the perspectives of local governments, but they may apply to other institutional or organizational contexts, including regional governments, for example, and non-governmental organizations. For better or for worse, some of this work that I talked about today is already published, and you can check these publications out for more details. I want to share with you some final reflections about what governance is and what it isn't. First, I just want to say, just corroborate this idea that having all the money in the world and having all the personnel in the world and all the people in the world won't solve all the problems of municipalities or local governments. It's going to help a lot. I am not doubtful of that. Of course, it's going to help a lot. But it is a prevalent view in the urban forest academic literature that, oh, we just need to give cities more money and we need to give them more power. And that's not going to solve all their problems. The decisions that they make are not only limited to the operational capacities of a city. A lot of urban forestry depends on the decisions by many other people. And how we engage in that collective decision-making process with those people is what is important from a governance perspective. Collaborative decision-making processes are important. Quite obvious. How we coordinate the decisions that we make with the decisions of other stakeholders is, of course, really important. And having some leadership on how these decisions are made is important. And I bring the example again of the Metropolitan Urban Forest Strategy in Melbourne that brought a lot of different stakeholders under one roof to talk about what's going to happen to the trees in the next 50 years. And make sure that you don't confuse leadership with strong leadership with strong government. Sometimes people see that, oh, to achieve better governance, we need to impose the decisions of people. And that's not necessarily going to result in better governance, of course. Finally, we need to recognize that stakeholder views are not monolithic, that a person representing an institution or organization is not necessarily going to reflect all the diverse views that are within that institution and organization. This is a problem with a lot of social sciences. I would say that sometimes we try to achieve the lowest common denominator, what most people are saying or what is most common and most frequent amongst a group of people. But the fact is that there is diversity of views within forestry and within stakeholders. And we need to recognize that diversity of views, actually to recognize that as an opportunity to engage in a more multifunctional narrative, a more diverse narrative of what trees can do, instead of just saying trees are good for shade, or trees are good for water, or trees are good for wildlife, when in fact trees are good for many, many things. For future research, I would dare to say that we must scale up empirical social science research. That I mean that a lot of social science is very context specific. We have a lot of single case studies, but I think that as urban forestry becomes a global discipline, there is a need to develop a more global understanding of the issues related to urban forestry and ground this understanding on stakeholder views and the people who actually make those decisions. This is really, really important from a management perspective, but also from a governance perspective, of course. We need to do a lot of more research in the global south. And here I'm going to showcase again my research in Latin America, because this is where most of the population is located, where the urbanization process is very intense, where there's a lot of biodiversity, and when there's probably a lot more opportunity to be innovative. Finally, I would like to say that governance is more than a destination. That a particular set of rules, tools, or conditions come together to create the best governance in the world. And that's not what governance is about. I think governance is a little bit more about starting a conversation about how we can work together better. We also need to recognize that governance is not a framework for researchers or academics to understand how society behaves. In some ways, it's a lived experience by the stakeholders, by the people who are in the ground making decisions about things. In some ways, they do governance on a daily basis. Thank you very much for your attention today, and I look forward to engaging with you in the Q&A later after the presentation. Hopefully we'll connect in time and catch you guys right after the end of this talk. Thank you very much for giving me the opportunity again to present my take on governance and the perspective of local government professionals. Thank you. Hello, everyone.
Hey,
Putting
Camilo.
up my slides here.
I'm going to stop sharing.
And welcome. I want to first thank the organizers of the summer. Hello,
I think
Sandy.
the video just started again, Sandy. You just need to close the video file. Welcome with us, Camilo.
Yeah, thank you. Can you guys hear me okay?
Yes.
Okay, good. Sorry about the logistical nightmare here, but I'm here and willing to respond to questions you may have. You may have a lot of questions, or a few, but I'm here now. Thank you very much for the opportunity.
Great. Does anyone have any questions for Camilo? First of all, Sandy, did you manage to close the video?
I think I did. Sorry, I had multiple, but I think it worked well. I had it coming through my speakers because I had to put my headphones anyway. I think it worked, then people could hear it.
Yeah, I think that worked out well. So do we have
Benoit, I would be pleased if I could be permitted to address Camilo first.
Go ahead, Peter.
And my first question is, Camilo, when did you start wearing ball caps? Because I don't remember during your PhD you were wearing a ball cap, but maybe in that sunny Australia you needed to protect your dome. Anyway, don't answer that. That's fine. The first, I have a couple of comments and one question. The first comment is, as usual, that was an excellent presentation. I would expect nothing less from you, and you delivered extremely well on governance. The main comment I'd like to make is that I find a lot of the recent conceptions of governance to be too complicated. And I wish people would find a way to simplify the way they express what governance is. And I don't know if I had a chance to talk to you about this, but about 15 years ago, or maybe a little bit less, I was working in the Sustainable Forest Management Network, and governance came up as an important topic in one of my projects. And George Hoberg, professor at UBC, articulated a very simple yet powerful kind of a definition or conception of governance. And I keep it in my head all the time because it helps me frame up the very complex network of concepts that are involved in governance. And George said, you know, Peter, it's very simple. Governance is about who makes which decisions about what and how. And I've never seen that written in the literature, and I wish he had actually published that conception, because I think it highlights those important aspects or dimensions of governance, which then allows us to go deeper and deeper into the nuances. When I look at Anna Lawrence's published framework for governance, I start to glaze over because it's so complicated in that table of questions that she put in her paper on a framework for urban forest governance. a comment I'd like you to react to is related to this Melbourne Metropolitan Urban Forest Strategy. I did a little bit of research into that as I've communicated with you. And I think I discovered that while there was a huge amount of buy-in to the strategy as it was developed and published, it is actually not a binding document on any of the 32 municipal units that are within metropolitan Melbourne. And so I wonder if you would reflect a bit on how it is in governance easy to get to collaborative outcomes when people don't actually have to implement the collaborative outcomes. And so let me throw one more thing on the table and then you can respond. I think governance also needs to include the whole domain of influence in an informal way. And the more you dig into, the more I dig into decision-making processes, the more I understand that the real stuff happens without being documented or the relationships explicated and all that kind of stuff. And so there are many informal pathways where some of the players have incredible amount of influence and therefore power, but no authority to actually make and implement decisions. And I wonder if in any of your empirical investigations, you have found this, any kind of notions about this, the informal infiltrate and subvert kind of patterns in urban forest governance. Now I'll stop.
Thank you, Peter. Yeah, definitely some great points there. And I do agree with you that social scientists, and I don't consider really myself a social scientist, and many social scientists may not consider me as a social scientist. As you know, my background is more from ecology and from environmental science. But fate had it so that I started to do a lot of social sciences, and I've really gone deeply into some of the social sciences around urban forestry. But what I was agreeing to is that there's a problem with language, complexity of language in the social sciences, and a lot of that has to do with the disciplinary lenses. You know, people from sociology, from anthropology, from political sciences, from planning, they have very different frameworks and different ways to look at things, and sometimes use different languages to define something that, as you said, should be designed very simply. I think we had this conversation before, and definitely the definition that you heard from that sustainable forest management, the who, the what, and the how of decision making is what is governance. Perhaps we forgot the why we're making that decision, kind of the narrative or the rationale of making that decision. But definitely that definition is simpler to use, and we should definitely start to use simpler definitions of governance rather. But we can also just, yes, it's the collaborative decision-making process. It's how people come together to make decisions about something that is collectively owned. You mentioned something about the Metropolitan Melbourne strategy. I definitely do agree. It's a policy document with not a lot of teeth, as they will say. But I would approach that from the perspective of social learning. I think besides the technical value of having something that coordinates decisions across metropolitan Melbourne, which I think that is valuable in itself, like kind of cover targets, how are they dealing with native tree species and all that stuff. I believe that there's also this component of social learning. Just coming together to have that conversation and participating in those discussions has been really important for the stakeholders. For the conservation groups and the development groups and lots of people who participated in that process. This was actually one of the strongest relationships that people working with trees in the city had with Melbourne Water, which is the organization in Melbourne that deals with water. It's kind of a weird private public institution. And Melbourne Water was constantly there in those conversations and trying to connect water with trees. And that was a very important connection. And I think there's a lot of things that we don't see in that document and that we don't see online in the public sphere that are happening, but that came out from those conversations. And I think that in itself is really valuable, and that goes to the heart of social learning. And I think we
as researchers sometimes have the task of kind of teasing those things that nobody sees and teasing them so we can learn something from them.
Thanks, Camilo. Does anyone else have a question for Camilo in his presentation?
Hi, Camilo. Thanks for the presentation. I just had a question. I was wondering if you discussed that urban forestry obviously is a relatively new research discipline, and as is urban forest governance. And as there's more interest developing around research in urban forest governance, do you think that, or what do you think are the applications beyond the academia community for this research? And do you think that the research in urban forest governance that's being produced has the potential to shape urban forest managers' decision-making, or should it even shape urban forest managers' decision-making?
Thank you. Yeah, no, that's a very important question. What's the practicality of doing social sciences? And this is a question that, of course, all people who do social sciences face constantly, because this kind of expression came to my head just now when I was thinking about it. When I went to Melbourne to work, a lot of urban foresters and technical people who participate in discussions, when they learned that I was doing a lot of social sciences, they were like, "Oh yeah, the fluffy stuff. The stuff nobody really cares about," but they just mention in a passing, "Oh yeah, all the cultural, social values, community engagement, blah blah blah," but they don't really care about it. And that's the case for a lot of social sciences. It kind of gets lost in the conversation. But I try to make my presentation a little bit practical. I think recognizing that internal coordinations within governments is a very important issue will stimulate local governments to try to foster that coordination, like engaging 3 people in the process of making decisions about planning policies and stuff like that. That is really important, instead of just telling them what's gonna happen to the trees after they've made those decisions, engaging them in the process of before they make the decisions. I think that is really important. I've mentioned a lot about community engagement. I'm going to contradict myself here a little bit when I say that resources are not important as some collaborative processes, but in this case, I'm going to contradict myself a little bit and say that resources are very important for fostering some collaborative process. You need the people and you need the money to go and participate in discussions, go and participate in meetings, have a community engagement coordinator position within the city, for example, and some very wealthy cities do that. Like, for example, the city of Melbourne, like I mentioned this in the presentation, the city of Melbourne is a very wealthy city. They can do lots of things and they have lots of money for a lot of things. And they have one community engagement coordinator within their urban forestry department. Many cities cannot do that, of course, because they don't have the resources to do it. But if the resources are there, I think it is very important to dedicate some of those resources, not just to the cutting of trees and the planting of trees and the selection of tree species, but to talking to people and participating in this engagement process, which I think is quite important. And part of my presentation was also about, let's think differently about trees on private land. Let's try to use regulations with a combination of incentives. Let's try to be more constructive, more creative about how do we deal with trees in private land. A lot of people think that just making these private tree bylaws, that's going to work, but in many cases they don't work. We were discussing this yesterday. There's a lot of a lot of tree removal permits get approved. Nobody has the capacity to review them all. There's a lot of problems that regulation causes. Regulation causes a lot of bureaucracies that local governments just don't have the capacity to go through. And thinking more constructively and creatively about how to use financial incentives to give people taxes back, to give them their money back, to keep the trees, is something that we really need to change that paradigm. That rules will work, that penalizing negative behavior will work, and I think they will work, and we still need them in some cases, but they're not always going to work. We need to have mixed tools, as I was saying, to do that. Yeah, so those are some of the practical ways that I think this governance research and decision-making research can help people make better decisions.
Thank you, Camilo. We have other questions for Camilo.
Well, students should ask, but I have one, but I'm happy to defer to students or postdocs.
And maybe I would try and not to put you on the spot, Caitlin, but I think this is your field a little bit. I was hoping you would pitch in and ask Camilo a question.
Yeah, can you hear me? I'm
Yes,
using
we can.
these AirPods. Yeah, I'm basically just like absorbing everything. I wouldn't say it's necessarily my field, but definitely something like it's what I am interested in and interested in learning. So definitely still a student. So kind of just absorbing Camilo's work, you know, read his papers and stuff. And yeah, definitely what I'm interested in, Camilo, is just like what you were saying about community engagement, engaging with different like demographics of neighborhoods. So that's one thing that has been on my mind for sure, is just like, you know, how do we engage with different types of people that have, you know, different levels of kind of like buy-in for green spaces and trees on their property. As we've discussed over the days, you know, some people see trees on their property more of a risk, whereas others, you know, will do anything to save these trees. So I guess not as much of a question. It's just kind of like what has been on my mind is what, you know, influences people's different perspectives and perceptions of trees, and how that gets people involved in the kind of policy surrounding urban forestry. But I don't know if you have anything to speak to that, but again, just kind of things that are floating through my head.
Yeah, lots of things. Thank you, Caitlin, for bringing up the issue of community relationships and engagement, because I think that is very important. How do we talk to people? There's a few things that I want to say. First, I definitely want to reinforce the caveat of my research. I come from a local government perspective. I wanted to understand how local governments engage in these collaborative decision-making processes, how they interact with different stakeholders, with the communities, with developers, with different cities as well. And I think there's a lot we can learn as well from non-government perspectives, or from different government perspectives, from regional governments. I mean, regional governments or regional government institutions. An example of that is the Regional Conservation Authorities here in Ontario, the National Capital Commission in Ottawa, some conservation groups surrounding some cities. They manage so much land, and some of them are private and some of them are public, some of them are government, some of them are non-government. And I think there's not enough research within urban forestry to understand what is important to them. And I think there needs to be more research about that. And non-government perspectives, I think a lot of governance research is from a non-government perspective. There's this mantra of doing governance without government because of the failure of governments to, you know, distribute natural resources and make good decisions around natural resources. And that's a conversation and a narrative that's been going on since the beginning of the modern environmental movement since the 1970s. And I think those perspectives are, of course, really important as well. But regardless, local governments are a key stakeholder. They're a key actor, and studying them and really trying to understand how they make decisions is still really important. I would bring up my issue of community perceptions. I do a lot of research around community perceptions, and I think we're still trying to understand a lot how people's cognitive and behavioral and emotional characteristics, not just their demographics characteristics, whether they're white or like high income and stuff like that, but their cognitive characteristics, like what do they believe in, how do they see trees? How does that influence in the level of engagement and the level of trust and satisfaction that they have? And we've been doing some research with some colleagues in Australia and here in Canada. Sandy is part of one of those research efforts where we're trying to understand those pathways. And I think going back to your question, Kathleen, about how do we engage different community members in different demographics, I think first we need to understand how people think. And how do we get to those people? And I think this is where that idea of multifunctional narratives come into place. For some people, natural conservation may be really important, and that's the narrative that we need to use. For some people, it's about shade and microclimate regulation and climate change. For some people, it's going to be about social cultural values. There's a very neat report that came out, I think, from the Forest Service in the United States a few years ago around community engagement for the urban forest. That one of the key points that they make is that you need to change your narrative depending on the stakeholder you're talking to and the community you're talking to. And I think that's going to become more important as we go forward. I mean, we are really excited that trees provide ecosystem services and they help conserve biodiversity in the city. But there are so many different things that we can say about trees to connect people with their trees. We can talk about indigenous things, social cultural relationships, and we can use trees as a way for people to learn about their natural environment. We can use lots of narratives in lots of different ways, and I think those are the ways to connect with those people, seeing things through a diverse lens. Thank you.
Camilo, I kind of had a question similar to that because I do some stuff with community perceptions. So in your experience in some of the municipalities you've worked in, do most of them seem fairly open to incorporating community perceptions, even ones that might not maybe line up with kind of the traditional kind of things they're trying to go with? Or have you maybe encountered any like unique kind of case studies of municipalities and the ways that they've engaged with communities and maybe incorporated some of their differing perceptions into the way that they're doing urban forestry, if that makes sense?
That's a good question. Thank you, Kit. It's a little bit of an abstract question because when we say perceptions, we need to first understand that perceptions are very different. Peter and I worked a lot on values of people. Values is what people consider important. People also have beliefs about trees. A lot of the ecosystem services literature studies people's perceptions on ecosystem services, like what do they want to get out from the valuation process of trees, what is more important to them. But that connects a little bit with the beliefs about the functions of trees that people have, whether they believe that a tree is going to provide birds with a home, or whether they believe that it's going to capture stormwater. And that relates a little bit to their knowledge about trees. And perceptions can also be just preferences about trees. They would like to have trees in that park, but not on that driveway. So perceptions are very diverse, and recognizing that perceptions are very diverse. People may have a positive perception of trees in general. Like I go back to the presentation about that idea that people have no problem with trees, but they don't want the trees right in front of their house. They don't want the trees blocking their highways. They don't want the tree leaves falling on their car during the fall. People have a lot of negative perceptions. So we need to go deeper into their perceptions, down to their beliefs and their values to really integrate those deeper perceptions, rather than just looking in the surface at kind of whether they prefer this or they prefer that, or whether they have a positive attitude or a negative attitude towards something. The problem as well is that a lot of research doesn't define the perception they're capturing. And I think that's a very big point that I have tried to make in my research as well. You need to be very precise with your terminology on perception. But I'm going to give you an example about community engagement and perceptions. The city of Melbourne did precinct plans. So they separated their cities in different precincts. And they did a lot of community consultations to figure out what kind of tree species people wanted in the streets, where did they want to plant them, how did they want their parks to look. And they did that about 5 years ago. And then they did another round of public consultation where they said, okay, this is what you guys told us. This is how we processed all that information. And here are the kind of targets and the objectives that we've developed based on that. And most people said yes. And now whenever they want to do something related to trees, they just tell people, well, this is what you guys wanted. So doing the consult, whenever people have a negative, my point is that whenever people have a negative reaction to something that the city is doing, the city just goes back to the community consultations that they did before, because they were quite comprehensive. And they just said, look, this is what you guys wanted. This is the precinct plan that we designed for your neighborhood. This is what took us like 5 years to figure out. And this is what you want. And the vast majority of people say, oh yeah, no, okay, that's fine then. So do your community engagement well, and you don't have to do it again for a few years, and people will just fall back in line in some way. Because like I said, perceptions are different. People may have a preference and an attitude at one moment, but that may change really quickly once you perhaps give them some information.
Great, thank you.
Sorry, I was muted. Sandy, did you want to just comment on what you shared in the chat? I looked at it quickly.
Oh, right. Sorry, I forgot. I threw it in and then was thinking of something else. I just put in because today in Toronto, and I'm sure the group will talk about it in a little bit, but the Toronto Ravine strategy, and this was the most recent, is the funding that was approved, because it's very timely for what you're talking about, Camilo, in terms of engagement and the public perceptions. In fact, it's an interesting story, and you certainly can't just get it from this link, but maybe it would give people some idea of what the goals are, etc. We had some discussion today too about whether how it relates to canopy cover, because I keep trying to bring this back to canopy cover. So it's there if people want to have a look at it, and it has another link to the actual strategy itself, the document that's been in the making for 4 or 5 years here in the city. My question was more, and it's tied to social scientists, and I know, Peter, you will agree with me that I am not a social scientist, but like you, Camilo, I've been pulled into it a little bit. You can't get away from it as soon as you're dealing with urban forests. And I think partly I was pulled in because of the work with Emerald Ash Borer, watching how whoever got to say what about, what we should be doing, it was so convoluted. And part of the success we saw yesterday from Montreal is that I think they were getting it right about who got to say what, whereas Toronto and earlier were really struggling with how we make decisions. And it takes a while to sort that all out. And of course, as you say, different places are different case studies. They will be different just because of the nature of the people and the history there. I guess, so in the context that I'm not a social scientist, my definition, or how I often try to explain it to maybe students and people I'm conversing with, is, and you can correct me if I'm wrong, I guess this is my question, is I kind of see it as top down or bottom up. I'm an ecologist, so I kind of see that systems work. There's decisions and power structure. Maybe this is getting into the power structure of, and both your regulations and incentives, when I look at that, I sort of put beside regulation is that's the no, you can't do this, you can't do that. It imposes upon the people what they can't do, and incentives say, yes, this is what you can do, and here are some good reasons, and we'll give you some more money to maybe do that, or other incentives. So to me, they're all top down. And this ravine, it made me think of putting the ravine link in there, because that's a lot of that, not all of it, but a lot of it is bottom up. It is the public seeing no way to have a voice. There are stakeholder meetings, I would say, which wouldn't necessarily include Indigenous, because Indigenous don't see themselves as stakeholders here. This is just the land that they're on. And so this is rather convoluted, but it's how I best understand is that you need both the top down and bottom up forces to arrive at similar solutions collectively together. And when they do, you get some good results. And I think this ravine strategy in Toronto is probably one of them, because there's been pressures both ways. I guess the question is my simplified non-social science version of this in any way approaching how you might see it or not, I guess? And how does that relate to what you've been sort of collectively trying to discuss?
Definitely. That's a very good point, Sandy. And I think a lot of researchers in governance and community engagement in green space and trees definitely take a more bottom-up approach, like who are the people doing something for the trees or for the parks, for the green space, without any coordination or motivation or even money or resources from the local governments, and they're doing it by themselves for their own, stimulated perhaps for improving their neighborhoods and their communities. And a lot of local governments have definitely failed in supporting these communities. And there's a lot of research in Europe on that, about community-based initiatives for example, managing parks directly or planting trees in their neighborhood directly without really going through local governments at all. And that research is really important. And we should all be mindful that more of that research needs to be done to really understand those bottom-up approaches to governance, I guess, making better decisions about what we collectively own. You mentioned power, Sandy. I would like to, guys, I would like you to read some of Lindsay Campbell's from the Forest Service in the United States work on power in urban forestry. She's a colleague of mine, and she has written a little bit about how power is distributed and shared among many people in urban forestry. Of course, from a very US lens. Her work is not international at all, but it may provide with a little bit of insight about how power is related to these questions. It's definitely not something that I touch upon, so I kind of rely on the work of other people. And yeah, I guess because I take a local government perspective, I look at things in a very top-down perspective. What can local governments do to influence people and to influence things? And that because a local government is a government. I guess a lot of people look at it, critique it as being too top-down. However, local governments continue to be very important. They do a lot of community-based work. They engage a lot of stakeholders, and in many ways, they are also the main financiers and the source of resources for a lot of those community-based organizations. They provide the money, and they provide the permission, perhaps, and they provide the knowledge and the savvy for community-based organizations to do their work. So I guess instead of saying local government as the guy we need to fight against, the big man versus little man, I think it's just one of the partners in this governance network of things, of people just trying to improve the communities they live in.
Yeah, I would say you did touch on it. Like, I guess when you're talking about narratives, like to me, that's bottom up, narratives, and that's what inspires and gets people engaged. And so I think you did touch on it. But I guess, and I agree with you, is that it's when those narratives, and now social media makes it much easier to share narratives, I think, is that when they align with the local government or the local power structure, then that really works. I think we come out with good things, no matter where we are in the world. But I will look at Lindsay's stuff. Thanks.
Thanks a lot, Sandy. Probably have time for a few more questions if anyone will have any.
Oh, sorry.
I have a question.
Go ahead.
Hey, Camilo, we've spoken a little bit about this in the past, but I guess I'm curious about, because your work is largely, at least from the perception that I've gotten, is going with sort of the interview style / gaining the perceptions of the managers that are involved with urban forests, and as well as the various stakeholders involved too. But I'm also curious because in my own research, I hope to look at the variety of great literature and reports that are provided by different stakeholders related to urban forests and reforestation efforts. And I guess I want to get your take on how information from some of these documents might relate to sort of the findings that you found when it comes to, say, like interviewing people on their either their engagement with some of these programs or their perceptions of the work that governments are doing and so on. Hopefully that's clear.
No, that's a very important question. And I think it's a very methodological question, and it's very important to get the methods right? And to understand what the methods can tell us and what they don't tell us. Indeed, talking to people is very useful, but the people's opinions and views may not necessarily reflect the mainstream policy of one organization or one institution. And when you look at documents, you see that more. What's the mainstream policy? What's the main thing that that institution or organization or that stakeholder, whoever it is or whatever it is, what are they trying to do from a formal and official perspective? So in that sense, using documents to collect data, can be extremely useful. And there's a lot of field and policy analysis and stuff like that that does that. So there's a very deep methodological support for that. But using a lot of interviews and a lot of collaborative discussions with people can complement that as well, because it's not just about the institution and what the institution and the organization stands for. It's also about what people stand for as individuals within the team that they work in, because that individual and subjective character of that person may give a particular flavor, make more decisions, for some decisions, for example, more effective than others. So, both approaches can complement, but it's good to be mindful of the limitations of one or the other. One is a little bit more subjective, more based on people's experiences of life and stuff like that. And the other one is more based on the mainstream policy or direction of one institution, one organization. So what you're looking at is a little bit more abstract, institutional unit, so to say. And when you look and talk to people, you're actually looking at that human aspect a little bit closer. And it's from a methodological perspective, like I said in my presentation, data from people needs interpretation, whereas data from documents is kind of given. So you can do, one requires a more qualitative lens, and the other one, you can do a more quantitative lens. You can count words, you can see the relationship between words and stuff like that. And you don't necessarily have to talk to people for that. So different methodological approaches for sure, and they have their strengths and they have their weaknesses as well.
Thank you very much.
Yeah, Benoit, I think given the time, we should probably see if we can't pull this to a close and take a break.
Yes, I agree.
Yeah. And so as we're leaving this session, I want to thank Camilo from the bottom of my heart for giving such a great talk. And I want to encourage you, Camilo, and you, Sandy, not to construct your impression of yourself based on the training that you have. And so like me, I have no training in social science, but I dabble in it. And so I would say that if we're able to do good social science, then we should see ourselves as social scientists. And following Camilo's career as I have, and nudging him now and then into uncomfortable places, I can tell you with confidence that if I want some advice on social science and urban forestry, I'm going to Camilo to get it. So Camilo, thanks again. I hope you can join us tomorrow. I'm not sure what your schedule is, but this was a fabulous way for us to enter the later conversations about governance related to our field trip. So thanks very much.
Thank you, Peter, so much for those kind comments. Just wanted to say that remember that urban forestry is an extremely interdisciplinary field. And the more interdisciplinary you can be and the more you can dabble in things that you're not comfortable with, perhaps the more successful you're going to be as well. Thank you, Peter,
Excellent.
for those.
Yeah, excellent point. So we are now sitting at 25 minutes to the hour. We should give ourselves a substantial break as we generally do. So 5 minutes to the hour, we'll be back. And then we'll be looking at Toronto, Halifax, Vancouver, and Montreal in that order. 10-minute presentations. I'll keep my clock very close to me to make sure that we don't exceed ultimately today the 5 o'clock Atlantic.